Hey everyone, I'm Ben Norton, and this is the Multipolarista podcast. And today we are talking about the presidential elections in Colombia. These are really important, and I would say historic elections. We just saw the first round was held on May 29th, and the left-wing alliance called the Pacto Histórico, the Historic Pact, won. And I think there's a reason it's called the Historic Pact. Colombia traditionally has been one of the most really kind of colonized countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and kind of an outpost for U.S. imperialism. Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan president, famously referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America. And for 20 years now, Colombian politics has been dominated by a very right-wing, you could say far-right movement called Urubismo, which is named after the former president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe Vélez. And Uribe, his family is closely linked to drug cartels. He had been working with the Medellin cartel. His family is also closely linked to right-wing paramilitary groups and death squads, like one called the 12 Apostles, that have been implicated in killing labor organizers and social activists. Colombia also has one of the highest murder rates of activists in the world every single year. Hundreds of human rights activists and social movement activists are killed, and there's complete impunity. So it was very historic that the Historic Pact won the first round of the election on May 29th in a landslide. I'm just going to show the election results here before going to our two excellent guests. These are the official election results from the Colombian government. And people can see here that the left-wing alliance with the candidate Gustavo Petro and the vice presidential candidate Francia Marquez, they won in a landslide with 40.3% of the vote. And what was interesting about this, and that's why I'm going to, in a second here, go to our panelists to talk about the very interesting developments in the Colombian right, is that while the left-wing alliance, the Pacto Histórico, did win, and that's a historic win because the left in Colombia has been completely marginalized and oppressed for many decades. Another very interesting development in this election is that the third place candidate, who is not going to the runoff, his name is Federico Gutierrez. He's also just known as Fico Gutierrez. He was the kind of establishment right-wing candidate who was backed by the Uribista movement and former President Álvaro Uribe. He actually lost. And in a surprise victory in second place is an even more far-right candidate named Rodolfo Hernández. He is a multi-millionaire real estate developer. He has an estimated $100 million in wealth. And he's also very right-wing. He's made a lot of misogynist comments, especially about Venezuelan women. He's made a lot of racist comments. And he also made this strange remark in 2016 where he said that he's an avid follower of Adolf Hitler. Now, in 2021, when he started his presidential campaign, he backtracked and said that he didn't mean to say that. It was a slip of the tongue. But it does show that this candidate is very far right, and he represents a new kind of right wing in Colombia that is actually not necessarily the same as the Uribista right wing represented by Federico Gutierrez, who is not going to round two of the election. So there will be a second round of the presidential election, which will be on June 19th. And to talk about the situation in Colombia, I have two excellent guests from the Troika Kollective. The Troika Kollective is an excellent anti-imperialist media collective run by people in Latin America and the Caribbean and the Diaspora. You can go to troikakollective.com. Here's their website. Collective is spelled with a K, troikakollective.com, and they have their social media links. And they have comrades on the ground in Colombia who have been reporting on the grassroots struggle against this right-wing narco-regime that has been responsible for killing hundreds of activists just in the past year alone. And of course, Colombia is one of the U.S. government's most important allies in the region. It has 7 U.S. military bases. It has received billions of dollars from the U.S. government through so-called Plan Colombia. So I have two great guests with me today from Troika Kollective. The first is Libre. And Libre is on the ground in Colombia, who's been reporting on the situation. I'm also joined by Yamir Chabur, and I'll go to him in a second. But Libre, I did an overview for people who don't know anything about Colombian politics. I talked about the main candidates, Gustavo Petro, representing the kind of left-wing forces. Now you have this other, multi-millionaire kind of far-right candidate, Rodolfo Hernández. And then you also had the Urubista right-wing candidate, Federico Gutierrez. So the right-wing vote was divided in the first round. Can you talk about what the situation has been like on the ground there in Colombia, what the grassroots struggle, the social movements are saying about this election, and what they think about the various candidates?
So, first of all, this is a huge victory. Definitely a historic moment for el pueblo de Colombia, the people of Colombia that have gone out. And we can just look to some of the numbers, right? This has been the largest turnout in Colombian politics, right? With 54% of the population going out to vote. And furthermore, a landslide victory of almost 12%, right, by a left-wing candidate, Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez. So the energy is high. People are like, yes, like we have this victory. This is the moment for us to like move forward, but also the reality here in Cuba or in Colombia, as you were sharing, right, is that we have to consider the reality of Colombia. Not everybody is able to go out to vote because this is a country where people that organize and people that try to go exercise their rights to vote have been killed. And we can see just before the elections yesterday that one of the leaders that was organizing was killed along with 4 of his family members. And so we're talking about voting being a high risk activity here in Colombia because of trying to maintain the status quo, trying to maintain a narco dictatorship in favor of the bourgeoisie. And so what Pacto Histórico represents is a move in favor of the working class people, the people that when we look at maps of Colombia and la periferias on the peripheries, right? Individuals that are looking for their rights to be respected, right? This scarf that I'm wearing right now is from Cauca, right? Which is an indigenous region on the northern border of Colombia that voted in mass in favor of Gustavo Petro. And one of the reasons why, and we'll dive into the particularities in a little more as we continue to talk, right? But this is a region that has been affected by Urubismo in a way because there's a closed border with Venezuela. And so that means there's no commerce in a place that, historically speaking, has had good relations with the government of Venezuela in terms of economics. And so there are, Petro has said that he will open up the border and open up talks with Venezuela so that they can talk economics and also to resolve some of the contradictions. The largest amount of Colombians outside of Colombia is in Venezuela, and they aren't able to vote. So these are just some of the things that we have to take into consideration. Now, the other interesting thing is the second runner-up, Rodolfo, is an individual that has not really been involved. This is an individual that hasn't gone out to talks, right? And so people are like, it's interesting that he was able to get in second place. But again, here in Colombia, the people are still happy because this is also a victory because the candidate Fico did not win. He will not be in the runoffs. And that represents historically an end, at least symbolically, of Urubismo. And so we're gonna be watching this. There has already been over 500 reported irregularities. So these are things that we want to be aware of as we continue to observe the elections. Because although this is a historic moment, although there is a landslide victory, we're going to be watching as the left, as the right starts to organize and build some coalitions against the candidate Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez. Fico has already endorsed Rodolfo. So we're going to be watching some of these things play out going up to June 19th, and we have to be very aware of these realities.
Yeah, someone made a comment. That is definitely not a Ukrainian bandana that Libre is wearing. Someone thought it was the Ukrainian flag. No, so no worries. There are no supporters of the far right puppet imperialist regime in Ukraine here. What does it say? It was frozen. Anyway, so I do want to get to you in a second, Jamir, to talk about the situation. But really quickly, Libre, I just want to follow up with an important point. You talked about the map of the voting in the first round of this presidential election. And here I have this map. And you can see you made an important point about Petro winning in the peripheral areas, these areas that there has been a lot of violence. And Colombia has been a country that's been wrecked by violence for many decades. I mean, there was a period that was actually called la violencia, the violence. And this violence has been targeted against campesinos, against farmers, against poor people, against the Afro-Colombian community and marginalized communities. And it's no surprise that people from these communities that have been most affected by the violence of these paramilitary groups and death squads and drug cartels, they are the communities that voted for Gustavo Petro. And not only Petro, but I should say that it's very important that his running mate, vice presidential candidate, Francia Marquez, is herself from the Afro-Colombian community, which has been completely marginalized historically. This is the image that they've used for their campaign. And Francia Marquez, honestly, I actually think that her politics are in some ways are even better than Gustavo Petro. You know, Petro has been running a kind of center-left campaign. He constantly talks about progressivism. He's not talking about socialism. I mean, Petro's an interesting guy because he actually was a socialist guerrilla in his youth. He was part of an armed revolutionary socialist group called M19, the 19th of May movement. But he later, put down his arms, and then he became a kind of more mainstream social democratic politician. But the fact that he's running this campaign with a grassroots organizer from the Afro-Colombian community is very important. And if you listen to her speeches, Francia Marquez, she's a great speaker, a very powerful speaker, and she talks about how every single day in Colombia, we are burying our loved ones. We are burying our comrades and social activists and people from the social movement. So before, one more question for you, Libre, and then I'm going to go to Yamir here. But can you just talk about what your experiences have been like there on the ground in Colombia, talking with people from these communities who have been so marginalized and have never been represented in Colombian politics? Do they think that with the Pacto Histórico, if Petro and Marquez can win, do they think that these communities that have been left out of Colombian politics will able to have a voice in the state?
The short answer is yes. And just to the map that you were showing, that was talking about how people voted. If you look at that map, the same colors that voted for Petro also happen to be the places where there's the highest risk of people going out to vote. So something to also consider is, yes, he did win a landslide victory in these areas, but what has been made clear as we're here observing the elections and as we're learning about the reality of elections here in Colombia is that there are no guarantees to people in the periphery regions, mostly indigenous, mostly African communities. There are no guarantees for their safety if they choose to exercise their right to vote. What does that mean? That means that if people are scared. They literally are fearing their life, and rightfully so, because these paramilitary groups are most prevalent in the periphery regions, right? And so we can also say, right, Rodolfo is winning in places that, in essence, don't run as much of a risk for people to go out and vote and exercise their right to vote. And so these are things that we also have to consider, that it has been said. And not only has it been said by the communities, but the government has not given any guarantees that people are safe to go out and vote in specific regions. And these are working class regions, these are mining areas, these are the coastal regions. And so these are things to consider, very real realities that that Gustavo Petro and more specifically Francia Marquez, and I agree with your analysis. In terms of politics and way that she's able to engage, I think Francia is a very solid vice presidential candidate, and really has played an integral role in addressing the issues of Afro-Indigenous, Afro-Colombian communities. And if they are to win, there's already plans to help address the issue that I just brought up, that up to now, no government has been able to guarantee the safety against paramilitary groups that are stopping people from going out to vote. And so that is absolutely key to understanding how the elections are playing out, because not everybody that can vote is going out to vote, and for different reasons. And the higher the risk, the people on the peripheries, right? These people had to really be careful. Now we're going into a second round, so we can expect to hear about people being assassinated leading up to June 19th, because we have to maintain the fear so that they can get the results that they want, which would be for Rodolfo to be the winner. And so these are things that people should really be aware of. And like, it's crazy how much of a risk the people are running just by going out to vote here in Colombia. People are rightfully scared in some regions to go out and vote, and so they don't.
Absolutely. And we've seen these incredible images of these rallies held by the Pacto Histórico, by Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez, and they always have these massive teams of security. And for people watching here, these are rallies in which Gustavo Petro is speaking, and they have these security guards holding these bulletproof shields, and they're always wearing bulletproof vests as well. And Francia Marquez, the same thing happens when she speaks. And in fact, a few days before the election, Francia Marquez was speaking, and someone shined a laser at her, which was clearly threatening her, saying, we could shoot you if we wanted to. And when people shine a laser at someone in Colombia, that's not like shining a laser at someone in another country. I mean, the reality is in Colombia, if someone shines a laser at you, you could be killed, because it's so common that politicians and social movement activists are killed in the country. So you're absolutely right to talk about the bravery of many of these figures. And, we'll talk about some of the limitations of someone like Gustavo Petro, but I think we have to understand those political limitations in the context of the fact that they're in one of the most right-wing, one of the most colonized countries in the region that has not been able to exercise sovereignty and independence. But Jamir, I want to go to you. Jamir Chabur is also an organizer with the Troika Kollective, and he's a member of the Colombian Diaspora. And can you talk about what the response has been like in the diaspora community, what people are saying about Petro and the other candidates, and also about the influence of Urubismo, the right-wing Uribista movement within the diaspora community? Because we saw this interesting speech that Francia Marquez, the VP candidate, gave. She was actually speaking in Washington, and she, pretty impressively, she called out what she called the ultra right-wing lobby in the U.S. that has been pushing for more aggressive policies, with this idea, also with this talk of so-called Castro-Chavismo, right? You can explain maybe what that is. So talk about what the narratives have been from the right wing in Colombia and in the diaspora, and what people are thinking about this electoral process that's going on.
Hey guys, to talk about the perspective of the diaspora, I would like to begin with saying yesterday I was in this basically historic neighborhood of Jackson Heights, Queens, that historically it was known for having like Pablo Escobar's minions, drug dealers, but now it's a little bit different, a little bit more working class migrants with people with mixed politics. But yesterday I was in a place where we were supposed to case Francia and Petro won, because a lot of people were pushing for the first round for them to win, just for the fact that they're afraid, and they known, like, historically, the right wing to do a lot of voter fraud or irregularities, or go as far as to kidnap people during the second round. So there was a lot of people who were depressed in the space I was in. But I remember doing an interview yesterday for Alliance for Global Justice, and just seeing the amount of Colombians in Bogota celebrating about how Petro and Francia Marquez made it to the second round. So I was telling my folks out in the diaspora, we have to be optimistic. During times of pessimism, you got to have revolutionary optimism, because we made it this far with a campaign that was ran by Gustavo Petro, who's an ex-guerrilla, and Francia Marquez, who's an Afro-Colombian social leader. But what people are saying too is, people are like, they still blame Uribe. They think that he's behind this, and of course, the right wing was very smart of how they were able to kind of like what they did with Rodolfo, this candidate that is a corporate millionaire, open fascist, that he's being called the Trump of Colombia. That basically because I was very surprised. I'll just start with that. I was very surprised that he made it to the second round, and yeah, that's him right there. I was so surprised because he didn't show up to no debates. Like, I would follow the debates, and it would seem that it would be between Petro, Fico, and this other guy named Sergio Fajardo, that he promoted himself as a censor candidate. People thought that those were the top three, and they didn't see Rodolfo. But it was very smart on the part of the right wing, because it's a part of the right wing or conservative Colombians that are getting sick and tired of Urubismo. So they promote Rodolfo as this neutral candidate, and make it look like the country's polarized between left and right, Petro Fico or Petro Uribe. So they make Rodolfo look like he's the neutral choice, and also just he's a businessman, he's a CEO. So folks, like this what had folks wanting to vote for him, and we have to see what's gonna happen these next 15 days. I mean, this guy, he's like you said, like what's been said, openly fascist, praising Hitler, talking about how women have no place in politics, speaking about privatization of education, not respecting the 2016 peace accords that were signed in Havana to promote the peace between the FARC rebels and the Colombian government. So we have to see, like, this right now is, I look at it like it's a reflection of the capitalist crisis going on worldwide, and especially in the Colombian context, where the choices are just so like opposite. So like you have somebody like Gustavo Petro, who's more like a social democrat, but like what's said right here, Francia Marquez is more revolutionary than him, because she wants to push for restoration of relations with Venezuela. And then you have Rodolfo, who I want to call Aldolfo, the way the right wing calls Petro Petrovsky. Like they call him, they try to fuse him with Russia and Putin. I'm calling this guy Aldolfo just because he's praising Hitler. That it's just so opposite to each other. And right now we have to be optimistic that in these next 15 days that we have to push folks who did not vote, which there was a percentage of folks who didn't vote it, to go out and vote.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is it might sound a little funny telling people like go out and vote, because in the US we're so used to hearing liberals be like, go out and vote for this imperialist who's not really any different from the Republican. But in the context of Colombia, I mean, this is a country that, again, has been so oppressed by US imperialism and also by the right-wing oligarchy, that being able to vote for even a candidate who's really honestly kind of center-left in the context of Colombia is actually something pretty groundbreaking and historic, because the country has been so dominated by a viciously violent and repressive right wing. And you mentioned, Jamir, you mentioned something very important, which is that the Colombian right wing did this very sophisticated tactic, which surprised me, where they recognized that Federico Gutierrez, who was the kind of establishment right-wing candidate who was backed covertly by Uribe and his network. And I should say that the current far-right president of Colombia, Ivan Duque, is also part of that patronage network led by Uribe. He was handpicked by Uribe. So they recognize in the polling and all of this that Fico Gutierrez was not very popular, that Uribismo has been, tarnished, the reputation, by its close links to drug cartels and corruption and death squads. So they did this very sophisticated campaign where Rodolfo Hernández, this hundred-millionaire real estate mogul, he portrayed himself as the anti-corruption candidate, and his party is called the Liga, the League of Anti-Corruption Governors. So it has anti-corruption in the name when you go vote. And he also did this very sophisticated strategy where he told people that he would vote for Petro if it was in the second round, if it was between Petro and Federico Gutierrez. So he portrayed himself as the right-wing opposition to Uribismo. So basically, the second round of the election on June 19th is going to be between the left-wing opposition, the actual left-wing opposition to Uribismo, and then a supposed right-wing opposition to Uribismo. But while that's how Rodolfo Hernández has portrayed himself, right on the night of the election on May 29th, Federico Gutierrez, as soon as he accepted defeat, he immediately endorsed Rodolfo Hernández. And then furthermore, we saw all of the right-wing Colombian politicians immediately circle the wagons, and they all began endorsing Rodolfo Hernández. Again, this is a guy who praised Hitler. He's a hundred-millionaire oligarch. And here is a former minister and an important right-wing politician in Colombia named Juan Carlos Echeverri. And he tweeted, he said, "No doubt, an engineer is better than a guerrilla." And in the context of Colombian politics, this is clear what he's saying. He's saying that the engineer is the nickname given to this far-right oligarch, real estate mogul, Rodolfo Hernández, because he calls himself the engineer because he got his start in engineering, even though he's, again, a real estate oligarch. And then the guerrilla is a reference to Petro. So you have all of these right-wing figures. Now, this guy, Echeverri, he was a strong supporter and a major ally of Fico and had actually been considered one of the people who was going to run for president, and he later dropped out and he endorsed Federico Gutierrez. So the point is that this guy, I wrote an article about him over at multipolarista.com, this far-right candidate who praised Hitler, Rodolfo Hernández, he's portraying himself as the so-called populist opposition to Uribismo, which is very cynical, but it shows that the right wing in Colombia recognizes that Uribismo is basically a spent force, that the Uribista movement is so unpopular, it's so corrupt, that they have to try to give a rebranding to the right wing. And I saw on Telesur, they interviewed a really good Colombian analyst, and he referred to this as the recycling of Uribismo. So I'm going to jump back to you, Libre, because you've been on the ground talking with people in Colombia. Jamir talked about the influence of the right wing in the diaspora. What do people in the grassroots movements in Colombia think about Rodolfo Hernández? Do you think that they believe his whole anti-corruption shtick? Is that going to work as a strategy?
So, in short, no. Right? People aren't really buying it. First of all, they're like, just go do a quick Google search. There are open cases against this individual. So it's interesting that they would claim to be anti-corruption when they have open cases of fraud and financial things that are against them, which this was brought up by Gustavo Petro in his speech last night. So the general, to give people a little bit of context, and just to dive a little bit more into, right, Rodolfo claiming to be a populist individual, a progressive individual, he's just doing this neoliberal tactic of trying to appeal to people by offering them something different, right? And so what we have to understand is, on paper, on a presidential platform, when you look at what has been said about what will be done and plans, Petro and Francia Marquez are the only real candidates for election, right? Because Rodolfo, when he and maybe this is a reason why he hasn't gone to these debates, but the few times that he has tried to speak on how he's going to address the economy and how he's going to improve the country, it's very vague and very broad responses that show a lack of knowledge about how to actually use the system and work towards addressing the presidential platform and the things that they say they're going to do, right? Like I said, Francia and Petro have already said, right, to address some of the economic issues, right? They're going to help a region called Cauca, right? And that's where this comes from, not to be confused with Ukraine, right? This is a scarf from the indigenous people that are organizing and that successfully organized, right, to get a huge turnout, despite being one of the regions that that faces some of these paramilitary attacks, showing out in mass to vote in favor of Petro and Francia Marquez, so that they can address some of the contradictions that have been created under Urubismo, where you have a border and a whole country that you want to do business with, that historically speaking you've had good relationships with, that under Uribe was cut. Furthermore, again, the reality that Colombians, progressive Colombians, went to Venezuela, and because there's no relationships with Venezuela, have not been able to vote. And so on the ground, the uphill battle of now to June 19th is gonna be Gustavo Petro getting some of the voters of winning over some of the voters that voted for Rodolfo, because I don't think, again, he's not a very strong candidate. He's just not Uribe, and I think we had to be very clear about that, right? And so is Petro, but they're trying to paint him as like a communist and socialist, right? They're trying to throw out things to scare people, right? So like you were saying, they're trying to compare him to Maduro and Castro, which his opinions about these countries, we don't have to dive into it, right? But he's a social democrat, right? But what is important is that there's going to be a task of Petro and Francia Marquez to get more voter turnout. Again, although historically speaking, this is the largest turnout, 54% of the population went out to vote. That leaves another 46% of the population that can be moved to go out to vote in the elections. And so we have to get some of the candidates from Rodolfo that, if they actually understand that he doesn't have a plan to fix any of the issues and that he is a neoliberal candidate that doesn't really represent any systematic change that is different from Uribe, then we're in a good position. But the reality here in Colombia, and we just have to observe the 2018 elections here in Colombia, is that we also have to be strategic about talking about these instances of fraud and how Rodolfo is a far right candidate that will take Colombia further back, will increase relationships with the US in favor of the bourgeoisie against the interests of working class Colombians. And so we're gonna, the Pacto Histórico is gonna have to tell this story very well leading up to, and also really push heavy on the things, on the platforms of being actual progressives with an actual plan, and let people understand the impact that they're going to have in favor of working class Colombians, because the right is going to try to come together in a coalition against Gustavo Petro, right? And so again, Fico already endorsed in his losing speech, he endorsed Rodolfo. And so, right, together that would have been 10 million, just over 10 million votes, right, in favor of Rodolfo. So there's gonna be uphill battle, not only to address some of the inconsistencies with claiming to be a progressive populist candidate, but also the fact that there's really no platform or plan. And unfortunately, the reality here in Colombia is that Fico lost, so it's an end to Urubismo, right? More symbolic than in actuality, right? But the thing that's happening here in Colombia is that they're saying they're both progressive candidates. They are both running with Afro-Colombian vice presidential candidates, right? And so what we have to understand is the role of identity politics, right? Francia Marquez, her politics are in favor of working class Colombians, and we're going to have to really push that hard, because the vice presidential candidate under Rodolfo is going to try to use her identity to move people in the same way that Francia Marquez has successfully been able to, coming from the working class, going to her community, going to vote in her community, right? Talking about places like Choco that are on the periphery that typically don't get attention, right? Focusing on these communities and going to talk to these communities like they have been, right? Francia Marquez, right before the elections, went to Cali, right? When she easily could have just stayed in Bogota. Why? Because the Afro-Colombian community needs to know what's going to be done when they vote in favor of Pacto Histórico, and they need to know that the people are with them. So between Petro and Francia Marquez, they have been going to specifically these periphery regions that, historically speaking, has either led to the killing of or the kidnapping of people, progressive individuals that are running for the presidential candidate, right? So that says something. There is change in the air. There is a reason that people are like, this is a historic moment. But we have to be also understanding of the climate that both of these individuals are being painted as progressives, although we know in actuality and in practice, the only real candidates, the only real progressive left-leaning candidates are Petro and Francia Marquez.
Yeah, well said. I mean, this is a tactic often used by the so-called populist right. And we've seen the attempt to portray Rodolfo Hernández, again, who has $100 million in wealth, as a so-called populist, which, I mean, how much can you relate to average people if you have $100 million in wealth in a country, by the way, where the minimum wage in Colombia is around $250 per month, and over 40% of Colombians live in poverty. Over 40%, nearly half of Colombians live in poverty, and yet you have this candidate with $100 million who portrays himself as a man of the people. I mean, it's really cartoonish. But Yamir, I want to go back to you, and I should say to people watching or listening that Yamir is such a dedicated organizer that he's in the bus on the way to a rally. You know, never time for a sleep, right? So that's why, you know, sometimes his signal's going out a little bit here. But Yamir, I want to ask you about to talk more about the political situation in Colombia in the past several decades, the violence, how it's affected, you know, the Colombian community in the diaspora, also your family and your, you know, friends and loved ones. How has it really impacted and destroyed so many communities? And do you think that, you know, that this election could finally mark a kind of turning point in the extreme violence that Colombians have been subjected to over the past several decades? It's still so mind-blowing to me that there's all this constant propaganda about Venezuela, whereas right next door, every single year in Colombia, there are quite literally at least 90 massacres. Last year, there were more than 90 massacres of activists, and hundreds of activists are killed every single year in Colombia. And of course, meanwhile, we're supposed to believe that Venezuela is the real problem. So talk about what the violence has been like in Colombia and how it's affected Colombians.
So yes, Ben, thank you for the shout out. Yeah, I'm always moving. Just to add, like, where I'm going right now, to add to like this whole conversation, I'm right now headed to Philadelphia, accompany Venezuelan feminists that they're here on tour against the sanctions. I'm here in support of them because they're right now kind of being followed by the Escualidos, the right-wing Gusano Venezuelans here in the diaspora. And I say this in connection because I do this because of my Bolivarian spirit, my Bolivarian nature, which has been influenced a lot by Hugo Chavez. And in connection with Colombia, Colombia is a country that's Bolivarian, that was liberated the way Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia by Simón Bolívar. And all of this connection of like the violence, displacement in Colombian society goes back to an oligarchy, a very vicious oligarchy. One of the most vicious, I think, in all of South America, and that's because this is an oligarchy that formed from la traición de Bolívar, the betrayal of Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America, who wanted to unify the continent in the Great Colombia, La Gran Colombia. So in order to understand the context, like to understand like the decades of violence, the century of violence in Colombian society, is understanding that history, and also like why is there this hate for Venezuela? Because Venezuela has awoken within Colombian society, within the Colombian youth, this Bolivarianism. Not making Bolivar into just a statue or this like first grade thing that you had to know for school. No, he's awoken. Chavez and Venezuela has awoken this amongst the masses of Colombians, which is the reason why there's this animosity towards Venezuela. But in connection with this oligarchy, this oligarchy for 2 centuries has been open to vende patria, selling their land out to the United States imperialists, going back to the Panama Canal, allowing the U.S. to separate Panama from Colombia, allowing the U.S. to come in and kill banana workers, like during the banana massacre by the United Fruit Company, allowing the CIA under Plan Lasso, which was led by William Yarborough, to come in and form the paramilitaries as part of the national security doctrine, as a way to not spread the influence of the Cuban Revolution, and also as far as to put have the DEA in Colombia. The DEA has been in Colombia for like over 20 years, 30 years, and Colombia is a state where it exports the most cocaine, the most drugs in the world, and now paramilitaries, as we see how the paramilitaries try to go into Venezuela, or they train paramilitaries in Honduras to oppress indigenous leaders, or just right now with Jovenel Moïse in Haiti, the ex-president, which he was killed by hired Colombian paramilitaries. So overall, like this right-wing oligarchy, and it's very interesting that Rodolfo Hernández comes from the region known as Santander, because it was a guy named Pablo de Santander that betrayed Simón Bolívar. So, and you see also, like from what I've heard about Petro, Petro, when he was the mayor of Bogota, he took down the portrait of Santander and put the portrait up of Bolivar. Even his revolutionary movement, M19, that they robbed the blade of Bolivar, la espada de Bolivar, the sword of Bolivar, to try to retake it for the people, para el pueblo. So there's a lot of parallels with this history of Bolivarianism and understanding the Colombians in this context. As far as like my family too, like my father was a ex-guerrilla. He was part of the EPL. He was locked up with Petro back in the 80s and forced to the United States, where he had to be exiled for a couple of decades. But overall, Colombia has been a country that's had an armed conflict, because Colombia is worse than a capitalist system, is worse than a neoliberalist system that many youth from the FARC that I speak to would say, from the legal faction, Las Comunas, it's a semi-feudal society where most of the land is owned by 4 to 6 families. So there's like when you have this understanding, you have the understanding of why social leaders get killed, or why we have massive displacement. Colombia is one of the countries that has massive displacement in Latin America. That's why 6 million of our population lives in Venezuela, and why the Colombian government would not allow the Colombians in Venezuela to vote. because they know that the turnout would have been completely different for Petro and Francia. So, and also me being here in this historic neighborhood of Jackson Heights, Queens, I talked to a lot of Colombian youth that were part of El Paro Nacional that have had to flee because of political persecution. And have had to cross the Mexican border. I've had family members that have had to cross the Mexican border. So like this election is very important for us. And if Petro and Francia win, it will mark a change for us in Colombia, and including Francia being a Afro-Colombian woman, social leader that comes not from a popular city. She comes from a very small village, a very Afro ancestral village. And also, you know, Colombia is the third country outside of Africa with the highest population of the African diaspora, third to Brazil and the United States. So we have a lot on the line, and we have a lot to gain, and we need to push these next 15 days for Petro and Francia to win against these fascists, because now the Colombian oligarchy is showing their real teeth.
Yeah, and Yamir, talk a little bit more about the role that Colombia has specifically played as under these right-wing Uribista forces as the kind of attack dog for U.S. imperialism in the region. We see that you mentioned that currently the Colombian far-right government of Iván Duque does not recognize Venezuela as a legitimate government. It still recognizes Juan Guaido, this complete clown who's president of Narnia, as people joke in Venezuela, who has never won a single vote in a presidential election, unlike Nicolás Maduro, who has won tens of millions of votes in presidential elections. So the Colombian regime does not recognize Venezuela. And of course, Colombia has also attacked Cuba constantly, attacked Nicaragua, also attacked Bolivia. I mean, the government of Colombia has been used by Washington to attack left-wing forces, not only in the country where they're killed, but also across the region. And maybe you can also talk about the strategy to try to divide the Venezuelan and Colombian peoples, because both of you, Yamir and Libre, you've been talking about how there's all this cultural interchange. Of course, under Simón Bolívar, which is not that long ago, less than 200 years ago, Venezuela and Colombia were part of the same country. Culturally, they have a lot in common. The accent is similar. You know, people both say chévere, right? Like there's a lot in common. And food is pretty similar. And there are also 6 million Colombians in Venezuela. Colombians are still actually one of the largest refugee communities in the entire world. And now, of course, there have been millions of Venezuelans who have been displaced because of the U.S. war on their country, the hybrid war and economic war. So there are these disgusting attempts to try to divide the Venezuelan and Colombian peoples as well. So anyway, you know, Hugo Chavez referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America. Talk more about why, you know, you think that Chavez said that.
So yeah, Ben, so to add on to your point, as far as Guaido, you never know, he might surprise us and try to auto-proclaim himself the president of Colombia. But yeah, you might, you know, the right wing might try to pull that out too, you know.
He has more support in Colombia than in Venezuela.
Well, yeah, I would think a lot of like the viejitos or cuchos is a word that Colombians and Venezuelans use to refer to old people would buy into. Like the cuchos would buy into Guaido auto-proclaiming himself as the president of Colombia. But anyhow, as far as going back to the what you were saying about Colombia being the Israel of Latin America, yeah, most definitely. I mean, receiving military aid, the way that Israel is like a foothold for U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, Colombia is a foothold for U.S. Imperialism militarily in Latin America. Colombia has over 9 military bases. You have over a lot of the paramilitaries and militaries that get trained in the schools of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia. The schools of the Americas, where a lot of death squads in Central America, like the Contras, or in Guatemala were trained, or dictators like Videla from Argentina or Pinochet from Chile received this training from U.S. imperialism. So yeah, Colombia has been this bastion for the continent of constant right-wingism, and not just like militarily, I think, but also like politically. Like when we were talking about this thing of Castro Chavismo, this type of like propaganda against the left has been utilized in other countries and other campaigns, like in Mexico against AMLO, or also in Ecuador, which Uribe was very much a part of. Guillermo Lasso, the right-wing banker who's the president right now of Ecuador, campaign, you know, to get people to be afraid, you know, oh, if you vote for Correa's candidate, Ecuador is going to become like Venezuela. And this whole thing about like Venezuela baiting, like this whole idea of pushing Venezuela as a failed state. You know, and the reason why Venezuela is the way it is because of the economic war that Washington has imposed onto the country. And a lot of people don't understand that. But that's the thing, like the way they portray Venezuela as a failed state, it's the way Colombia is, and worse. I mean, Colombia is a state that's had over 60 years of an armed conflict that has not been resolved. Because even though the FARC laid down their arms, you still have the ELN, the Ejército Liberación Nacional, the Liberation Army, National Liberation Army, that is still active. And still you have the paramilitaries constantly killing social leaders, and also just the amount of Colombians that leave the country because they can't find economic stability, and a lot of them risking their lives right now crossing the Mexican border. So, and the other part of that too is that the Colombian right wing tries to utilize the Venezuelan migrants as propaganda as well, to say that, look how the Venezuelans are migrating, as well as, you know, in any Colombian community you're going to find Venezuelan escualios. And it's funny that a lot of them try to argue with me about, oh, how, you know, Venezuela's going to become like their country, blah blah blah. But I have to remind them that their country is under intensive economic war, intensive sanctions, whether they want to believe it or not. And I point to the Venezuelan opposition, the more diplomatic opposition, not the far right Voluntad Popular of Leopoldo Lopez and Juan Guaido, that do believe in these sanctions and see how these sanctions are also affecting them. And the reason why Venezuela is in this economic turmoil that they're in. So understanding that is to deconstruct this Castro Chavismo that has been embedded in Colombian society, because due to the Cold War politics, like going back, as I said, to Plan Lasso in the 1960s, right after the period of La Violencia, after the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who was a very progressive liberal candidate that was assassinated by the oligarchy, and who was a candidate too that was pushing for Latin American integration, who met with a young Fidel Castro, and was being watched by the CIA. After his assassination, then you have the period of the violencia with the liberals going against the conservatives, and then you have Plan Lasso that comes into place with the CIA imposing the paramilitaries in order to not allow the expansion of the Cuban Revolution. And then in 1964, you have the formation of the FARC, that they come out of the farmers' movement after the Colombian government, under the orders of U.S. corporations, were told to attack this autonomous region known as Marquetalia, which the FARC comes from and were formed. Like I'm saying, like this, I'm explaining all this history in order to understand how there's been a big time indoctrination of anti-communism, and folks not understanding why we need to support Petro, and why we need to have an alternative from this semi-feudal capitalist system that we have, and how
Hey, Yamir,
I kind of lost my train of thought. Sorry, but no, that's all right. My bad. I kind of lost my train of thought. I was going somewhere, and I forgot how I was trying to end it. You know what I mean?
No worries.
It was a lot
good
to process. You know.
Yeah. Someone commented here. They said, no true flags here. Commented, I can barely talk, yet alone drive and talk. But you're not driving, right? You're just in the bus. Yeah. I hope you're not driving. No. Cool. Well, I know that Libre has to go pretty soon, so we'll probably do like 10 more minutes here because he has to go soon. But Libre, I want to go back to you here before we start wrapping up and talk about, you mentioned that there are people in Colombia on the ground where you've been talking to them and meeting with activists. They're really working on organizing as the second round comes up on June 19th, which is just in less than 3 weeks here. One of the main concerns that people have, which you kind of alluded to, is when you crunch the numbers, it could be very close. These are the results from the first round. Gustavo Petro and the Pacto Histórico, the left-wing coalition, which includes, I should mention, the Pacto Histórico includes, it's a big 10 of the left. So there are social democratic groups, progressive groups, feminist groups, and there are even some disaffected liberals, but there's also the Communist Party. So there are some socialist forces. It's a broad front of left-wing and progressive forces. You could say it is a united front is the term that historically has been used. It's a united front. So the Pacto Histórico got roughly 8.5 million votes, which is really good, and that's historic. In the last elections in 2018, Petro came in second place, and he ultimately was not able to defeat the current far-right president, Iván Duque, largely because Duque stole the election by buying votes with drug money at the orders of Álvaro Uribe, and he did this through a drug dealer named Ñeñe Hernández, who died in mysterious circumstances in Brazil. This is all pretty well documented in Colombia. It's known that the current, I want to stress this point, the current sitting right-wing president of Colombia, Iván Duque, who's a major ally of the U.S., he's only in power because he stole the election with drug money by buying votes. And I mean, this guy has been actively praised by all U.S. presidents. Here's a bunch of photos of Joe Biden with Iván Duque. And of course, there's a bunch of photos with Trump as well. I mean, this guy, has bipartisan support in the United States, and he is completely linked to the drug trade and stole the election with drug money. So, I mean, Colombia, in this episode, I titled it, against Colombia's narco-regime. It is not hyperbole to refer to Colombia as a narco-regime. Colombia is responsible for over 70% of the world's production of cocaine, and the CIA has traditionally used Colombian cocaine to fund its dirty operations in Latin America, especially targeting Central America and the wars on the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the FMLN in El Salvador. But anyway, the point is, getting back to this map here, so that the Pacto Histórico, the left-wing coalition, got 8.5 million votes. But if you combine all of the votes from the other two main right-wing candidates, Rodolfo Hernández and Federico Gutiérrez, they do together have nearly 11 million. So if every single person who voted in the first round votes the same, that means that, of course, Petro is going to lose. But obviously, that's not how elections work. Usually in the first round, there's not as many votes as in the second round, because the second round is technically the more important vote because it determines who the president will be. So there's probably going to be more turnout in the second round. And it also assumes that everyone who voted for Gutiérrez and Hernández ends up voting for Hernández, whereas there are some people who voted for Gutiérrez who just may not vote. And there's even a possibility that some of them could vote for Petro. Now, of course, we talked about earlier how many people who supported Gutiérrez and Gutiérrez himself, who represented the Urubista movement, many of them have already openly endorsed Hernández. But there's a possibility of some of them going to Petro. And there's also the strategy you mentioned that the Pacto Histórico is trying to activate new voters, especially in marginalized areas in the periphery who have been traditionally left out of politics and oppressed by the state. So do you think that it is a realistic possibility for Petro and the Pacto Histórico to win in the second round? He did get 40% of the vote in the first round. Do you think that he can get the extra 10 or 11% that he needs to win in the second?
I don't only think it's possible, I think it's necessary. This is literally touching on the points of like, who will Colombia be for moving forward, right? So under Pacto Histórico, it represents many historic things that are more than just symbolic. If Pacto Histórico, when Pacto Histórico wins on June 19th, right, it will mark the first time left government in Colombia. It will mark the first time where there are intentional policies being passed that benefit Afro-Colombian and indigenous people. It will mark the first time that there was an actual plan to implement the peace accords that were written that have not been respected by any of the right-leaning governments, which has led to the massacres and the assassinations of leaders and organizers against Urubismo, against the far right. And so I think what the feeling here is, we have to do it now. This is the first time in history where we can say that Colombia is actually close. More people are going out to vote. More people are getting involved in elections and politics. Pacto Histórico is strategically going into the periphery communities, but also focusing on the role of women and the role of young people, the role of students, trying to keep Colombians in Colombia. Again, when we ask the question, who will Colombia be for? It will be a Colombia for Colombians under Pacto Histórico. If the far right, through fraud, through buying of votes, is able to somehow win, it will mark a continuation of far right movement in favor of U.S. imperialism. And so I think not only is it possible, it is a necessary thing that has to be addressed. And like you said, Pacto Histórico is made up of a lot of groups. Right here, right, we have Unión Patriótica, a communist group. I was just with the Partido Comunista de Colombia yesterday. And these are individuals that are boots on the ground, going into the communities that where they have to be careful, right? And they have to talk to certain people to be able to go there, because there are the drugs are prevalent in the communities like Ciudad Bolivar, where I went to yesterday, right? Where it is a community that popped out of nowhere, out of necessity, right? And so this is a city of almost 1 million people that have been over almost a decade have been moving and mobilizing under Unión Patriótica, not just them, right? But in large, it's the main organizing group that is a key factor in Pacto Histórico. And so I think this left alliance is what is needed to create a Colombia for Colombians. And that being said, also, we have to be vigilant of the diaspora and their role in these upcoming elections and going out to vote, and also having testigos, having observers in the Colombian consulates to make sure that fraud is not happening. Because historically speaking, that has been one of the factors that has played into more progressive individuals not being able to win, has been the role of the consulates not really having a system, or if they do, it's ran by the far right government. Again, over 500 irregularities have already been reported in the elections that took place leading up to and finishing up yesterday. So these are also things that we have to be aware of. And if people want to get involved, there are going to be, since there is going to be a second round, right? We were hoping for a first victory, but now the fight continues and we got to keep on going. And again, people are boots on the straps. They're already changing their strategy to get some of these people that voted for Rodolfo, to get people that haven't voted yet to vote, and also to try to speak on and inspire Colombians, because again, in certain places, it is literally a matter of life and death if you choose to go out and vote. and who you're going to go out and vote for. And this is not like people have been killed and people are like legit going through a lot of things on the peripheries of Colombian society. And this is just a reality that we have to recognize, and that will be addressed under Pacto Histórico. And I think that will lead to more engagement of the Colombian people. And the opening of the border with Venezuela will lead to a Colombia that has a more stable economy that is being pumped into working class people, specifically working class people, right? Not in favor, right? So we don't have to say that Colombia is the Israel of Latin America, because that is not a good thing. And that is not what the people of Colombia need or want. And so I think we have a very important role to be in international solidarity with Pacto Histórico, which represents the only option to create a Colombia for Colombians.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. And Libre, I know you have to go soon because you have a bunch of things you're doing there on the ground in Colombia. It's a very busy time. So I want to conclude with one final question for Yamir. And it's a tricky question. It's a tricky contradiction. And that's, we kind of obliquely acknowledge that Gustavo Petro, who is the only realistic option looking at the material conditions of Colombian politics, he's the only realistic option from the left to actually coming to state power. But his coalition, the Pacto Histórico, has a lot of members, including parties that are much better politically than he is as an individual, including, he talked about the Communist Party. There's also parties that had been traditionally linked to, the guerrilla struggle against this, partially feudal, brutal regime. So it's a united front. And I should also say that the Foro de Sao Paulo, which represents the left-wing and anti-imperialist forces across Latin America, the Foro de Sao Paulo has also come out publicly in support of Petro and the Pacto Histórico, despite the fact that Petro has made very, I would say, egregious critiques, unfair critiques of Venezuela, of Cuba, of Nicaragua. Obviously, we understand that Petro is making these comments attacking, Venezuela and other socialist forces in the context of Colombian politics, which is extremely far right, extremely violent. We've been talking about that for an hour. So maybe we can understand that, Petro is a politician and he's saying what he has to say in order to survive within the confines of Colombian bourgeois democracy. But I'm wondering if you can just kind of speak to the way that you reconcile some of the positions that Petro as an individual has taken, criticizing some other left-wing forces in Latin America, with the understanding that, that the Pacto Histórico is really the most important left-wing political movement right now that actually has a chance of taking state power in Colombia.
So yeah, Ben, that's something that I've had to reconcile for like a while with this campaign. I'm a big time supporter of, the Troika resistance, as we say. That's why we call ourselves Troika.
Yeah.
Supporting the Cuban Revolution, Sandinista Revolution, and the Bolivarian Revolution, all three sister revolutions. And me understanding like Colombian politics too, as a Colombian, and understanding like the ecosphere of like how it's very anti-communist and just very pro-Washington, I can understand why Gustavo Petro would say stuff like calling Venezuela a dictatorship, Nicaragua a dictatorship. But he's very careful with Cuba because he's been to Cuba like a couple of times. Like a couple of months ago, I think he wasn't feeling well. He had like a kidney problem and he was going to Cuba to get treated by doctors. And he's also very careful to talk bad about Cuba because of the peace accords, the peace agreements of 2016. So he has to be very smart of how he gets baited by the right wing, because they're going to bait him. Like there was a debate, I think one of the last debates before his closing, that he was asked a question. He was asked, if he wins the presidency, is Nicolás Maduro going to his inauguration? He said no, but he said it in a very smart way. He said no because there's no there are no relations between the Colombian state and the Venezuelan state. He's like, in order for Nicolás Maduro to come to his inauguration, there needs to be an established relation between the Colombian government and the Venezuelan government, and that has to happen right after the inauguration. So I thought that was a very smart way to answer that question, because he knows that he's gonna get Venezuela baited. But then on the contrary, like we were talking about Francia Marquez, I believe, would push for a reestablishment of between Colombia and Venezuela. Why? Because she understands that the war between the both nations is not benefiting the people at the border. It's not benefiting the economy of Colombia, and also going back to like just the overall armed conflict that Colombia has had internally. Colombia needs peace. You know, like Colombia needs to have like peace process. You know, like what was signed in Havana, because the people need to reorganize and reform themselves. So I feel that Petro, you know, regardless of his comments of Venezuela and Nicaragua, is that we have to support him. And now more than ever, where you have the oligarchy showing their true teeth, their true anti-Bolivarian teeth, with this guy coming from the region named after the traitor Santander. And also, like, it was very interesting that the brother Libre, I was just thinking about this, like he was in the neighborhood known as Ciudad Bolivar, which is like a hood in Bogota. So I feel like anywhere, like in Colombia, where you have like anything named after Bolivar, it has to be it's like a bad neighborhood. And I feel like that's done intentionally by the oligarchy. So we have to look to Gustavo Petro as the Bolivarian candidate, and then Rodolfo Hernández as the Santanderiano. Is, you know, it's a fight between it's an anti-colonial struggle in a way, because you have also el Pacto Histórico, as we were saying, is a organization of left-wing forces, you know, like the Communist Party, Unión Patriótica, but also in movements that don't have too much of a political leaning, but are also part of the Pacto Histórico, like La Minga Indígena, that have done a lot of different protests for their territories, or folks in Palenque. That Palenque historically is a town in the northern coastal region of Colombia, which Libre visited, which was formed by Afro-Colombian Maroons. It's a Maroon village where the folks there speak their African language still, and Spanish is their second language. So I say this to say that in these next 15 days, we have to pray that the indigenous Afro ancestors are with Petro and Francia.
Yeah, well, and you know, you talked about the importance of things named after Bolivar, and it was very symbolic that actually at the end of his campaign, before the first round of the election, Gustavo Petro, he ended his campaign in Plaza Bolivar, which is the Bolivar Plaza in the center of Bogota, the capital. That's where he chose symbolically to end his campaign. And you can see this photo of him waving a giant Colombian flag with the security teams with these giant shields to make sure he's not shot and killed. But for me, that was a very symbolic choice, concluding his campaign in the heart of the capital, in the plaza named after Simon Bolivar. So with that said, I know both of you guys have to run, and it was a really good discussion, a lot of excellent analysis. I just want to give you both a chance here when we conclude, if you want to plug anything and maybe talk briefly about Troika Kollective and where people can follow you. So go ahead, Libre, first.
Hey, comrades. Just really quick, simple message. Definitely follow us. We got a lot of things cooking up. We got a lot of dope interviews. We were able actually to interview Maria Jose Pizarro, who is the daughter of one of the progressive presidential candidates in 1990 that was assassinated. One of 4 candidates that was assassinated, to be clear. And we're going to be interviewing Vicky Sandino. So if you don't know who Victoria Sandino is, look it up, because it's going to be a really dope interview. They have done amazing things with the FARC. But at the end of the day, Troika Kollective is an anti-imperialist collective that is working to fight against imperialism, not only in the global south, but also on Turtle Island. Because revolution is necessary and we must fight for it wherever we find ourselves. And the best way that we can support our people in these countries is to get rid of the primary contradiction, which is U.S. imperialism. And also, definitely feel free to hit us up. If anyone is in the diaspora that wants to be one of these individuals that go to the Colombian consulate, we are working with our comrades. The head of the Colombian move to have testigos at the Colombian consulate. I just met with her yesterday, so we're going to be in the process of building that out. So hit us up on Troika if you're interested in that, because that's going to be our role in international solidarity with the people of Colombia for those that can't come to Colombia. And so let's just be aware. Let's not listen to the lies that imperialism is going to say when Pacto Histórico wins. And that's also part of the reason why we're doing this work, so we can combat the lies with truth and also with interviews from working class people that have been in this struggle for decades. Because what is happening right now under Pacto Histórico is what the people of Colombia deserve. And, Petro and Francia have been very clear, even though there have been assassination attempts and death threats, and they can easily choose not to go talk to people, and they can easily choose not to put themselves in certain positions, but they have, right? So the shields, those I would say are more symbolic because they already know what they're getting themselves into, understanding the history of this country, right? And so what we had to know is, as Francia and Petro have said, right, this is not a victory for Petro. This is not a victory for Francia Marquez. This is a victory for Colombians that up till now have not had any party that has been able to take a line that is trying to uphold the peace accords and that respects the life and the dignity of Colombians to be the protagonist of their own country. And so in international solidarity, let's stand with the people of Colombia as they are going to be in this literal fight in some places, right, leading up to June 19th elections.
Yeah, very well said. And Yamir, I'll give the last word to you. I also want to show this comment from Tesla Stellar. This guy is talking, driving, and fighting Western propaganda at the same time. But Yamir, final word. Do you want to talk a little bit about the work that you do with Troika and anything else you want to add before we conclude?
The woman, the Senator Libre, interviewed, Maria Jose Pizarro. She's the daughter of Carlos Pizarro. That, yes, like Libre said, he was a candidate for the Colombian presidency in the 90s, but also he was the Máximo Comandante of the M19 guerrilla movement, which Petro comes out of, Gustavo Petro. So I just wanted to add that in, just also because I was like, I love that how Libre met her. My father was actually locked up with Carlos Pizarro, so it was an honor just to see that Troika is getting those type of interviews. And that going back to the work that I do with Troika is basically trying to fight the media war, and also creating content and also being in support of Latin America and the revolutions happening in Latin America. Like recently, I was in Cuba for May 1st, and I fell in love with Cuba, and just seeing the amount of different international delegations that were there from around the world, and just seeing the amount of Colombians there, the Pacto Histórico campaign is time to make change in a country like Colombia, because Colombia deserves to have popular power, popular democracy. That we are Latin America. We are a Bolivarian nation, just like Venezuela, and our people deserve to live better. El buen vivir, or like how Francia Marquez says, a vivir sabroso. So, yes, I'm just excited for these next 15 days, and I'm very hopeful that our African and indigenous and Bolivarian ancestors are with us.
Very well said from both of you. We were speaking with Libre and also Yamir Chabur from the Troika Kollective. You can check them out at Troika Kollective, that's collective with a K.com. And you can find them on Twitter and Instagram at Troika Kollective with a K, but there's no E in the end because it cuts off with the character limit. I have a link. If you're watching on YouTube, I have a link to their YouTube and to their website and to their Instagram and Twitter in the description below. And I want to thank all of the super chats. Thanks to ILL State Fishing and A. Lauren and D or David or D David and Kyle Wool and David again. I want to thank everyone for the support and all the super chat comments and all the comments. ILL State Fishing has a comment: boycott sham U.S. Summit of the Americas. I'm going to be doing an episode about that this upcoming week because it's happening this June and it's been a complete disaster for the U.S. It's multiple countries in Latin America and also the Caribbean. CARICOM, the Community of Caribbean States, have all announced they're going to boycott it. So I'll be doing an episode on that this upcoming week. And I want to thank Libre and Yamir, and I will see everyone here at Multipolarista for the Multipolarista podcast. I'll see you all next week. And Libre mentioned that they're working on a protest against the Summit of the Americas, which is the Workers' Summit of the Americas. So I'm going to be doing coverage of that in the upcoming week. So with that said, I'll leave you all here, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks a lot to everyone for listening and watching, and thanks to the Troika Kollective for joining me today. And see you next time.